Today is Friday, November 8th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here once again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, what are we talking about today?
Today, and we do want to get right into it, is Feast Memories. We did that last year at the end of the feast, and we thought, why not do it again? We had a lot of experiences this feast, you and I, in places that were very much not America. And so why not talk about the feast? Hopefully you at home are reminiscing, and that's what we're going to do with you right now.
That sounds good. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Jake and Julia, after a feast-long break. In fact, I mentioned them. I did have some questions a bit in Australia while I was there about, Jake and Julia, who is that? So that was kind of fun.
Oh, that's good.
It was fun. So welcome, everyone, to our Feast Reminiscence podcast. We did this last year. We're going to do it again this year. And I should say, because this is kind of a nice round figure, this is our last episode of Season 3. We could have ended it before the feast like we did last time, I think. However, honestly, I'd like our episodes to end in such a way that the total number of episodes is a rounder figure, so that the digits of the season episode number in this, I know it's ridiculous, but it makes life easier for me. But what that means is this is episode 120. Mr. Robinson, We've done 120
wow.
of those.
It's kind of amazing. Privilege. Yeah, it's funny because 3 years ago, we thought that it would work, and we were pretty committed to doing it, and still... To be here 3 years later is kind of amazing.
And I don't know if you did, but it's one of the things I'll mention before we get into some other reminiscences is I did get feedback on the podcast. So in terms of where we were, my wife and I had the privilege of serving in Malaysia for atonement for that time and to spend the time with the brethren there in Kuala Lumpur. Then after that, we flew to Glenelg in Australia for the first half of the feast. And then on the other side of that part of the peninsula there, I would call it a peninsula there in Australia, to Forster, the first site close to Adelaide, second site close to Sydney. Spent the remainder of the feast there, got to see Sydney and such, and then came home. And I had a number of people come up, both in Malaysia and Australia, older, but a lot of younger people. When I say younger people, a lot of young adults mainly, a few teens as well, come up and say how much they appreciated the podcast. They appreciated seeing you in some sermons online, so they could put a face to the voice. And give some feedback. In fact, one of the helpful feedbacks we got was that we tend to be quieter in the first part of the podcast and get easier to hear later on. So we're trying to use our radio voice early on, aren't we, Mr. Robinson?
Well, you are. I don't think I'm there yet, but I'll keep working on it.
I'm not sure I am either. And I have to say, we only know so much what we're doing. I don't know how to tune all the knobs to make sure we're heard very well.
Right. Our one wise thing is we made a nice investment in the microphones, but everything else is kind of off the shelf for what we had.
Really, it is. And so this is still kind of a two-man operation, sort of getting these out. Let's go ahead and launch into it. And I know you're going to talk about Kenya. Mr. Robinson was in Kenya for the feast. But I'll launch in by saying that in terms of feast reminiscing, one of the things I greatly appreciated about this feast was all the brethren I got to spend time with, and my wife did, brethren from different countries. It was amazing for a lot of different reasons. One, culturally, there were certainly differences. We had fun in Australia talking about the lingo. That was a lot of fun. I actually asked AI to try to craft the most Australian sentence ever speakable, and that was a lot of fun. In Malaysia, it's people, they bring it up and say, hey, if you're going to speak in Malaysia, you're going to take your shoes off, because that's part of the culture. You take your shoes off. So I got to give my first sermon in my sock feet. That's
awesome.
That really was.
Actually,
it was kind of fun.
Okay.
It was fun.
I'm on board.
Yeah, but those things aside, it was the people. I say this often at the end of feasts when I've coordinated feasts, is that we can talk about the sights all day long, but you can have a beautiful sight and the brethren just simply not let God's Spirit flow through them, not be the Christians that they're supposed to be. Same thing with us in the ministry and the coordinator, and it's still going to be a terrible feast. And yet you can have a sight that is not a beautiful place. It's just suboptimal. And yet if the people shine, God's Spirit shines through in those people, it is a wonderful feast. And in all three places we were this feast, including actually services in Sydney right after the feast, the brethren were just amazing. Some of you are listening, I know, because you told me. Everyone there in Malaysia and in Australia, thank you. Thank you so much for making our feast just wonderful. You were so receptive to the messages. You were so There was so much humility, frankly. Getting to spend time with Mr. Moses' family and getting to spend time with Mr. Montgomery's family, getting to spend time. Well, if I start listing everybody, I'm going to start feeling bad. But, the Burnett's and everyone. Anyway, it really was wonderful. And it just reminded me that no matter where I am in the world, where I want to be? I want to be where God's people are. There's a lot of places I would love to go, but if God's people weren't there, it would automatically become a less than satisfactory place to be. Yes. So anyway, that aspect is really made the feast.
Have you had this observation? Because I feel like I've observed it several times, and I've even talked to other members about it who seem to agree that they had a similar observation. And it's anytime you've gone to the feast in somewhere, so let's just say somewhere in the United States, and we stay in that site the whole time, and then you maybe, so like we've stayed in Florida a couple times, so you might stay on another 3 or 4 days and
okay.
enjoy the beach and recover a little bit. The area where the feast site was does not feel the same after the feast is over.
Yeah, very true. Have felt that multiple times, especially when we were coordinating. We're coordinating, in the ministry, you have even less time with your kids and stuff. So we'd be coordinating in Branson, and plus you have business to settle,
Yep.
So even the feast is over, we're taking care of things with various folks on location, would end up being there another day or so, and the site is still there. The restaurants are still there, activities are still there. And it's intangible. It's almost like you could put your hands in the air and expect to feel it. It's not it's not the same side.
It's a different spirit.
It is.
It's like God's peace doesn't reside over that area in the way that it previously had. And, I agree, by the way, 100%. Like the feast would be meaningless without God's people there.
Right.
Just staying at home and keeping the feast in my own little home would be nothing like being with other like-minded brethren. When we were younger, we didn't think enough about that. And we kind of prioritized going to areas that we wanted to go and see. But, especially once we were in the ministry, I don't know if everybody knows this, but you get an email from CAD that asks 3 areas that you want to go. And so you put 3 areas down. And I jokingly referred to the first time I got the 4th option, which was which means not one of those 3. But by then I had learned there's no other way to put it. Every time I've gone to a feast site where I've either been asked to go to serve for some reason, or maybe it's just like, hey, there's a couple minister friends I have there, I'd love to go spend the feast with them, and you choose it for more spiritual reasons than for, like you said, a beautiful
for amenities or whatever,
exactly. Right? Best feast sites, best feast I've ever had. I don't want to name one, so I don't want anybody to get offended, but when you travel like you did this year, and me to a lesser degree, like it is definitely more work, more effort, a little more tiring, but man, so rewarding. We enjoyed our feast in Kenya so much.
Oh, good. That doesn't surprise me. Yeah, Mr. Weston has really focused on that. He's tried to remind all of us, what is the purpose of the feast, right? What is the purpose? It's easy to think of it as a vacation, right? It really is, but it's not. It is something that God has designed for spiritual purposes. Focus on those. And if you give yourself over to those spiritual purposes for the feast, it just maximizes God's ability to do what he's going to do with that feast with you. So it sounds like you're saying something similar that I did. Because I noticed that even though Australians are an Israelite country in that sense, so there were some similarities. I almost feel like more of a Texan association with Australians, even more than an American association with Australians. But there still were cultural differences. And then in Malaysia was very different culture, right? Which actually I want to reserve part of that, just some small observations for another point. But it was interesting, no matter how different our cultures might be, when you're there in services with everybody, it's just a reminder. We are spiritually the same, part of the same body. We're singing the same hymns. We believe the same things. And I'm sure you experienced that in Kenya as well.
Yeah, no, we really did. And I know there might be some younger listeners that might kind of raise an eyebrow a little bit about, you could see some of the photos and see how the cultures are clearly different. But you're exactly right. And I know we've talked to other ministers who've had the same travel experience, and that we'll all tell you the same thing, and that is when you get around God's people, the spirit is the same. Cultures may be different, language difficulties to navigate, and I might mention mine here in a moment there in Kenya, but it really is, when you get around God's people, you know it. And that we felt that. So just I might mention briefly on our Kenya visit, for those of you who don't know, Kenya is in Eastern Africa, and the country is actually split by the equator. The northern part of the country.
Oh, is it? I actually didn't know that's
yeah.
exactly where it was. It's neat.
And there are two sites that we went to this year. You fly into Nairobi, which is the capital, and then we caught another flight over to the area. The city is Kisumu, but Kendu Bay, and some of you may be familiar with that name. That we've had a congregation or a site there for a long time, and Mr. Abak was featured in the Behind the Work film. I think not this current one, of course, but the previous one where Mr. Nathan,
two ago, I think it was.
Was it two? Ago. Talked about the work in Africa, and Kenya really is an amazing country, and we've been blessed. Frankly, we've seen quite a bit of the country because of the way you travel through the country. So we spent the first half in Kendu Bay, and I want to especially thank Mrs. Abak for taking us under her wing and like really looking after us and making sure we were taken care of, and we appreciate it. Had a great time. On Sunday, halfway through the feast, we flew back to Nairobi. I think the first thing that struck me about Nairobi, other than in one sense, it kind of feels like any big city, a little overcrowded, a little too much pollution, kind of noisy, but felt like a big city. But they have, at least the time we were there, had this crazy Southern California climate. It was a little cool in the evenings, hit around 80 in the daytime, low humidity, and just felt really nice. And of course, Mr. Simon Muthama and his wife looked after us and took care of us. And it was a smaller feast site there because out in Kendu Bay, it was 150 people or so. And then on the weekend, it actually, I won't get into why, but it can be difficult for people to get there. And over the weekend, there was a larger attendance. But the Nairobi one was in the 40s. And I do want to mention two people specifically because I can still see the smile on their faces. If there's one thing I would say about Kenyans is, obviously not everybody, but like if you amalgamated them into like one character, it's smiling.
Really?
The Kenyans smile, and they have an amazing smile. And so Lewis, who drove us around, was a podcast listener, and also Justice,
that's awesome.
Who helps out. He didn't help with us this year, but I know he helps with Mr. Nathan, and they were both very enthusiastic about the podcast. So hello, guys. It was really, really nice to get to spend some time with you again, and we appreciate all the help and the enthusiasm, a lot of positivity.
How nice! Oh, that's great to hear. I'm trying to think. Okay, I'll start transitioning because we found that we could go on forever, and today has been really busy. In fact, I ought to warn us. I'm not sure if I'll be able to edit it out, but in about 4 minutes, we're probably going to have the big announcement. Yeah. The building lets us know that they're going to.
If you don't get out, you're trapped behind security.
We do have good security here at the building, but half an hour and stuff before things close, they kind of let us all know. And we are recording the podcast much later today because it's one of those days. Yeah. And we have council meetings next week, so it's going to be just busy all around. But anyway, we'll just work through it. We'll see if you guys can even hear it on the microphones. So I'll go ahead and transition to the next point. And this was an observation I made. It's very specific. And technically, I guess it isn't the feast. It's it was during Atonement. It was a lot of fun. It was, like I said, it was in Malaysia, and the hotel where we stayed was attached to a mall. Like the mall and the hotel were owned by the same corporation, a massive corporation there in that part of, at least that part of Malaysia, I would say probably throughout. But it was interesting. I'll just put it this way. It was interesting seeing the impact of Islam in that mall. And I'd say Kuala Lumpur in general, but definitely in the mall. And I put it that way, and some of you might already think, oh, he's talking about something really negative. And I'm actually not. I think our listeners understand that I'm not pro Islam as a religion. I'm not pro the beliefs of Islam. It's clearly problematic in a lot of ways, and it's not true. The religion that is true is the one I ascribe to, But that said, there were certain standards you could tell that were enforced in the mall that we just wouldn't get away with anymore, say in the United States where I currently live. I would say, for instance, the level of modesty, and it is my understanding, and I did talk with locals there, and they did explain that's part of the influence really is the presence of Islam in the culture, because I think that's the majority religion, I'm pretty sure, but the dress was more modest in general. I'm not saying it was completely modest, You might, you have a midriff here or there, in the mall walking around. But overall, the level of dress was better than I would see in an American mall. I would say the level of conversation, even in the mall environment, as in, I don't mean conversation with people directly, but what you're hearing around you. You're not hearing kind of the loudness of some that are there that to have fun and they don't really care about the people around them.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say I'd have to check with my wife. I think there was literally a sign somewhere that essentially highlighted, hey, if you're getting too loud or something, that's not going to be tolerated. I'm having to paraphrase.
What's the punishment?
Well, there was a lot of security, and I would say they didn't look like the stereotypical mall cop you see in the movies, right? These look like some both male and female, they look like serious security, but they were also a part of the mall culture. I saw one security guy, for instance, there was like a shirt that was sort of messed up on the ground that had fallen off a display, and he picked it up and straightened it up and put it on the thing. Where it looked deadly serious was outside of the jewelry places in the mall. And this was a massive mall, by the way. I think it was at least 5 stories, and it would have looked like an impressive mall in America, to be sure. But in the jewelry stores, they also had a shotgun. It looked like a straight up sawed off shotgun, the security guys. And you think, oh boy, that sounds really oppressive. Have to say, we were there for days, did not feel that way. Actually, everybody seemed happy. No one seemed to walk around looking like they were skulking or restricted. If anything, it was a bit freeing for some of those things not to be there. Now, was the occasion that there was at least one occasional wife I saw who had the full, I don't know if you'd say, there's our warning, but that kind of burqa where all you can see is their eyes, I can think of it.
Yep.
And it was definitely a mixture of we're there, where were we on the world? Compared to Charlotte, if you want to know the time, you just switched AM and PM. And that's where you were. Yeah. But yet, I actually felt it made for a better mall experience. And so in this case, I'm not saying it's magically Islam. Even if America took its, let's just say it's counterfeit Christianity more seriously, you would see an uptick in some of these things. And in contrast, we went from there to Glen Elg, and Glen Elg was wonderful. Man, we loved that feast site. It's beautiful. If anyone wants to go to the feast in Australia, both of those sites were amazing. Both were on the beach. But immediately you go to Glen Elg, and what do you get on the beach? Well, you get Australians being a bit more free with how they dress and free in their clothing. And the stark difference when we'd be kind of quick to judge people's standards, and that's part of what gets us in trouble when we're addressing Islam. We say, look at you guys, you marry all these women, and you don't really care about women. And they come back, and yes, there's terrible things about some of their things, but they'll say, well, what do? You have one man impregnating multiple women. He just doesn't have to marry them. What's kind of the difference? And they'll highlight these things to where our country's trying to export democracy and export this. And they're saying, if what you're exporting turns my malls to where they look like your malls, I don't know that I want that, right? That cultural difference was fascinating.
I think that also give us a natural segue into your next point, because I already hear it a little bit coming out of this point, because I've had similar observations as well. And by the way, I looked it up. Is 61 to 63% of Malaysians are Muslim.
Okay, I was pretty sure. We looked into all these statistics before we left, and I was almost certain that was the case. And I think the Moses family pointed that out to me also.
20% Buddhist, 10% Christian. I rounded those off. One of the things that's always intrigued me as I've grown in my understanding of ancient Israel and God's purpose for them and the different ways in which they failed. And also, it starts to give us insight into when God is going to kind of pull the plug, if I may, on the Israelite nations and punish them. And I think it's kind of bound up in this idea, believe it or not. Once Israel became worse than the nations around them, and in our case, we don't know for sure anciently if this was the case, but in modern times, I would argue the United States and the other Ephraimite countries, Manasseh and Ephraim in their modern form here in the Western. I don't have to be careful with Western world. Do I have to list all the countries every time? Canada, Australia, the United States,
Western civilization,
Western civilization.
Which would include also some non-Israelite countries, just Germany and such.
Yeah.
But right.
I would argue we have lagged behind much of the other nations in culture, in morals and ethics, and that when we began promoting our garbage entertainment around the world, and the other ways in which we've pressed. I mean, I don't want to get political, but I know that we put pressure on other countries, including Kenya, because we talked about this when we were there in Kenya.
Oh, really?
Pressure on them to accept homosexuality and some of these other things. And so it shouldn't surprise us, sadly, to see it's not that the other nations went up. It's that the U.S. sank down. But it's probably a combination of things. I'll probably get myself in trouble with this tact I'm on. But I think what we can say is, what did you observe? Our nation is becoming more and more lawless as every year goes by, and less truthful. And at least in some of these other nations, they recommend we'll keep a baseline of morality that's now higher than what we see in the Western civilization countries.
No, that's very confirming that you saw something similar like that, and I suspect we'd see that in places. I'm not saying that in every way other countries have a stronger sense of morality. What I am saying is that at this point, America and other countries, they're eating off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They're not in proximity to the tree of life. They're eating off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because it's not just evil. And as a result, there is a mix. And when it comes to certain moral standards, to be sure, not all of them, but certain moral standards, honestly, you travel around and you will become surprised at how many have actually left Western civilization a little bit behind and actually moved in a different direction. And whether that's them moving forward or us moving backwards, maybe a little from column A and a little from column B.
Maybe you'll salvage my point a little better with Mr. Montgomery's coverage.
Mr. Robinson is turning into the king of transition. And that was another point I wanted to make. And we might even wrap up not long after this. But there were a lot of good messages at the feast. I mean, really, I'm so grateful for all the speakers. I was going to say I was grateful for the speakers in Malaysia. I did get to hear one. The offertory was very good. But then
I had
it was
the same experience in Kenya.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, poor Mr. Robinson, he spoke a lot. It's like, oh, the speaker was great.
It's incredible.
That's right. But, in Australia, I definitely got to hear a lot of speakers as well and appreciate all the effort they put into their messages. And I feel bad just singling out one. Like, for instance, I thought Mr. Edwards' take on a Jubilee year and stuff like that, it wasn't all about counting and prophecy. It was about some substantive meaning, and it was I thought it was really great, very insightful. I've still got notes to go back over, and do go back over your notes. Don't just let them sit there. There's a reason you take notes.
Mr. Hernandez will tell you that.
Oh yeah, why else take notes? If you're not going, I think he literally said that this week.
He's the one that gave the sermon about the early and the latter rains, and he talks about when you go to the feast, you actually collect a lot of seed, because after the feast, if you lived in Israel, you would begin the next harvest. And the next harvest begins with plowing the fields, planting the seeds, and the early rains aid in that process. So he's like, if you want to get ready for your next harvest, you need to come back from the feast and begin your next spiritual harvest. And it's really pretty deep.
No, it is pretty deep. Okay,
I have one anecdotal story.
Oh, before I get to that one, that sounds great.
Yeah, because what you've just said reminded me of it. I just thought for some of our audience that they might find this kind of interesting. So if you've ever been, especially if you're from the U.S. or some of these other countries, and you've been to, like I've been to a feast sites in France and in Costa Rica, and both had real-time translation. So even if somebody's speaking in Spanish, you had somebody translating in real time. You had headphones on, and so you would hear it at the same time.
Oh, right.
In Kenya, we don't have that luxury. And it would be difficult, and because there's actually a lot. The numbers are fairly high, especially in Kendu Bay. It'd be difficult to do, but there's other challenges. So what you do when you speak is, I'll go up there and I'll say, God is very disappointed with the modern nations of Israel, and then I'll pause, and then there's a person standing right next to me with his own microphone, and he'll relate what you just said. In Kendu Bay, it's related in the Luo. I think I'm saying that right. Luo. It's the tribal language of most of them in that area. Whereas in Nairobi, they translate it into Swahili, which is one of the three national languages, or one of the two national languages: English, and Swahili. And so you get used to that, and it's actually kind of nice because it's a slightly slower pace. And while they're translating, you can kind of really think a little more about your next point and frame it the way you want. And then when we came back to the U.S., there were a lot of ministers out of town, and for a variety of reasons, Mr. Strain asked if I would do the sermon here in Charlotte. And I thought, no problem. I've just been speaking every day practically, right?
You're warm.
So I get up there to give a sermon in the traditional way that I'm used to, and the first 10 or 15 minutes, I felt like maybe I was in a fever dream because it was so much faster, the delivery, than what I had. And you realize you don't have a lot of time to think about your next thing.
You really had to
right?
adjust.
And I had to adjust. It took me a little. It took me a little while to adjust to the pace and get back to the more rapid, direct monologue rather than the back and forth translating.
Interesting. So. Theoretically, I read about a study recently where they it's not a recent study, I don't think, but they compared multiple languages and the speed at which they communicate, and the syllable rate is so much faster for some than it is for others. But then they broke it down to meaning and like bits of information. And what was fascinating is the bits of information passed was relatively constant. So some speak very quickly, some languages speak slowly, and yet the amount of information passing would be about the same. So what's interesting about that, to me, is that in that case, you're kind of you only have, in a sense, half the time you would normally have for a sermon. It was unusual for me. I did the opposite. When my wife and I were traveling, the first sermon I gave with an audience of speaking mixed language, and they did have the translation. It could be live. In fact, it was Mr. Reese Ellis's wife, Fanny, who does a wonderful job, I understand.
She's good. Yeah.
And they gave me the sermonette time and the sermon time, which why would they do that? It's way too much me. And in the sermonette I gave it, but I sat back down, and my wife kindly during the song afterwards said, don't pause. That's what they do. Just let it be live. It's like, oh yeah, because I bet that was frustrating as a translator when you're translating live. Yes. Then I'm pausing and she's pausing. I never thought
about that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So I had to completely just ignore that and just kind of go to town normally. So thank you for the observation. Okay, so concerning the messages, there's so many I could talk about, but I do want to highlight something I thought specifically concerning Mr. Martin Montgomery. He was the coordinator there in Forster. And I actually wasn't in Forster when I heard it. They had one streamed service in Glenelg, and it was the last day we were in Glenelg, right before running to the airport so we could get there for the next day. We didn't miss a service this year, which is kind of cool. We usually miss on the travel day. It's kind of hard to make it work out, but this time we actually squeezed it in.
Yeah, that would be hard.
It was fun. We had to leave like during the last song, but we made it. So we saw Mr. Montgomery, though he was in Forster, we saw him in Glenelg, and I thought his sermon was great. It was essentially, he spoke about because he's talking about how God is going to, in the millennium, fulfill his promises and his desires concerning Israel. And he goes back to what were those desires? He says Israel is essentially like God's firstborn among the nations. God loves all nations. That was one thing that Mr. Edwards established really well, I thought, in his message. God loves all the nations. He has a plan for literally all the peoples. But he does things in an orderly way. And just like with a family in ancient Israel, the firstborn may have been given double blessings, not blessings, inheritance and such, but he also had more responsibility. If the father died, then the firstborn had to take over responsibility, like making sure the daughters, which are the firstborn sisters, are married to good families, and all those things that lands on the firstborn. So he focused on the fact that God calls Israel his firstborn amongst the peoples, and they're blessed not because they're any better than anybody else. Mr. Montgomery kind of highlighted that. There's literally scriptures that say you're no better than anybody else. In fact, in some ways, you're a little scrawnier. You're a little less desirable.
It's even more than that a little bit. It's even like it's more like look. When you start thinking that this is because you're great for some reason, you're not.
That's right. He says, look, you are laying there in the ditch in your blood. Who would actually want that? But God made these people great not because of things we've done, but he was upfront about that. He said, because of Abraham's obedience. Abraham obeyed, therefore we're blessed, but that blessing comes with an obligation. It's like the obligation of the firstborn. And he said, as firstborn of the nations, what did God want us to do? Dr. Winnell likes to highlight this. You can read there, and he actually didn't use the same verse in Deuteronomy. He used a different one, if I recall. I could be wrong. I could go over those notes again, but it was still similar. He wants us to be an example of his way of life, what you can do when you're following God's way and you have his blessings, you have him on your side. And that's what he wants exported to the world. He wants the truth about the gospel. He wants the truth about the kingdom of God. He wants the truth about the beauty of his ways. That should be the Israelite nation's main export into the world. And what is it instead? I think he gave this exact example. What is it instead? It's Disney Plus and HBO, right? We have exported a way of life that is not God's way of life. It's America. Well, I'm speaking of my country now. It's America's way of life, which is what? It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where we pick the things we like that we see from God's way. But in these other cultures, they have good things too, and these other cultures have good things too. In fact, we'll make up some good things. And we're not exporting God's way. We're exporting this impure mixture that's the American way of life that still gives us Disney Plus and HBO. And I thought it was just because God is still in the millennium going to do that, but it's going to be a reset. He's going to take Israel and say, hey, we're going to do this again, but we're going to do it right. Yeah. And you're still going to be a blessing to the nations, but you're going to be a blessing my way, not because you're just good harvesters of wheat or whatever the case is, purely because God is in you now and you're going to do it right. I just thought it was outstanding. It was a really good sermon.
That's such a fantastic point, and that I knew that was one of the points you were going to bring out, but it was interesting your observation about Malaysia and their because it's apparently it is the official religion is Islam in Malaysia.
Yeah, and I actually had a scripture for that I didn't mention that I should have, and that's what Paul highlights in Romans chapter 2. Knowing that they're all eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he talks about the Gentiles, and he says for those any non-Israelite nation, he says in Romans chapter 2. I'm going to break in this sentence, man. Paul and his long sentences, but he talks about the Gentiles and says that. Starting in verse 14, he says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law, that is, they don't have any natural inheritance to God's law, when they by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness between themselves, their thoughts accusing or else excusing them." So there's a certain extent to which even those who weren't blessed with being given God's law still have an inherent understanding that, certain dress is wrong. Certain ways of behavior are wrong. It's a mixed bag because it's mixed in with some misunderstanding, but he says that they still have some understanding. In contrast, what we have going in the United States is even that bare basic inheritance you can get from simply being a human being that has some of the conditions of the law, some of the most, like respect your parents, try to stay married, be faithful, those kinds of things. We are actively as a culture trying to get rid of those things. We're actually trying to create a world in which, no, you don't have to do those things. Even, we're not going to get into the most recent election. We hope to talk, by the way, I guess there's at the beginning. You might have expected we'd talk about the election here because it just happened. Quite the opposite. We wanted to talk about the feast, and we do plan on getting into it, and not really the election so much, but how we as Christians think of such things. But honestly, one of the best things to do is to give things time and not just rush into some discussion. So we're giving that some time to breathe. But one of the things to say about the culture is what I saw politically leading up to this election is how much, say, the quote-unquote conservative side had embraced so much of the culture of the other side, which made them far more palatable, far more open to homosexuals than they ever, trans. Oh, that's ridiculous. But you know what, homosexuals, that's fine. Far more open to abortion. The official plank of the candidates was, well, no, we don't want to ban it, and all. We want to, let the states decide and stuff. It's tiny steps. But what you see is starting to push away on some of these things that they make their mark, and then when someone carnal comes to push away again, you still advance. I literally saw, by the way, a statement from something like an assembly of 30 or so transgender organizations reacting to things. And part of what they said was they were not disheartened because they had 2 trans people elected to an office. And they said, because, we recognize it's maybe there are steps backward, but we still made steps forward. And because they know how it works.
Right.
Well, that's what's happening. So what I saw there was a good example that, you know what? There are certain things that we do understand that people can be responsible for. And in Malaysia, with the influence of that particular culture, they were responding to some of those things. So, sorry, backtracking to the last
that's
point.
good. That's good because, it's funny. I saw this morning driving in a car. We were both turning right, but it was a red light, so we were both cautiously approaching it, and then they go first, then I go. But as I pulled up behind them, they have a bumper sticker kind of higher up on their trunk that says, protect trans kids, okay? But then as they turn, and then I turn, and I'm behind them, and I'm more square behind them, they also have a lower down bumper sticker that says, support Israel. And I thought it was such an interesting dichotomy. And your explanation there made me think of it. It's like what are the modern descendants of Israel? A real fine mix of the knowledge of good and evil.
It is a mix. That's exactly right. Oh boy, we could probably make the tree of the knowledge of the real meaning of living according to eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as a theme here in the future. I'll try to write that down somewhere. Okay, we could probably get close to. We can probably start wrapping up. Actually, it'd be a little shorter than normal, which some of you are probably saying, "Ooh, that's a relief." But the office is going to be closing here pretty soon, and I know I've actually got a lot more other work to do. So let me just wrap up with this, unless Mr. Robinson, you want to add another big point. We hope you had a good feast, for one thing. We hope that you are reminiscing about it. It's part of thinking biblically is not thinking back on your feast as a great vacation, which is still good. I still have positive memories of my kids riding go-karts and playing putt-putt and doing all sorts of crazy things. Those are part of the positive memories, but we don't think of the feast time as just a vacation. It was a time to dive into some other things, and it's not just a matter of, it was time to listen to sermons, it was time to take notes, but also it was simply a time to reflect on the other experiences that we have and to think about them differently. We didn't just go into the mall and think, man, this is a really nice mall in Malaysia. My wife and I actively talked about the things that we observed, in terms of thinking about it with a different kind of brain. And so we hope that you're still, to some degree, reminiscing about your feast with other people, because there's a reason it's a real highlight for the year for us. But let me wrap up with this. All of that's not going to make a difference. And this ties into, I think, a bit of the theme we had before the feast. All of our experiences, Mr. Robinson's, mine, yours, your parents or your friends, none of it is going to make a difference if it doesn't have an impact on your life. If you and I and Mr. Robinson and my family, if all of us a month from now end up being exactly the same state we were in spiritually. But I don't mean it doesn't have to be dramatic, though dramatic is great. But if we're in exactly the same place, if our relationship with God hasn't, the needle hasn't moved at all in terms of us being closer, if we don't see, the millennium a little bit better, if it's all the same as it was beforehand, then we've not really benefited in the way that God wants us to. But here's the thing, it's not over. The feast is over. But your opportunity to move the needle a bit isn't. Mr. Robinson and I just spent, looking at the clock, more than 35 minutes or so, reflecting on the feast and talking about those things. It's not over yet. You have the opportunity now to invest a bit. Go back and look about your notes. Go back and ask your friend or someone else, what did you learn this? Do something, and then take that, and regardless of what you've learned, if you wish you'd grown more or whatever, then invest in next feast, because the decisions you make right now, here around the end of the feast, it's those decisions that will make the biggest determination concerning where you are spiritually come next feast, come next fall, or for our Southern Hemisphere friends, next spring, when the feast rolls around again.